Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and a few gentlemen, as they say. Very pleasure to be here. When Deborah called and said, would you like to come to San Diego? I didn't say anything more, just yes. Didn't even know what it's about. I think you call us people from Arizona zonies. So I'm a zonie, but always enjoy being over here. Everybody in the room has a particular story that brought them to the character that they are today through your childhood events up until your adult years. I like to say that character is developed, not inherited. And mine was somewhat of an interesting story, starting as a child and through my adult years. In fact, Universal Studios is making a movie about my life. And well, thank you. It's a little humbling, but it's kind of fun as we're putting this together. In fact, it's in casting right now, and hopefully we'll start shooting in October of this year. But I was born in Chicago, and my parents divorced at a very young age. My mother left my father and never knew where she went. She would never tell me in later years. And when I was 5 years old, she came back and kidnapped me off a playground during a kindergarten recess and took me away from my father to start on her adventure, whatever it might be, to get back to Arizona where she had worked in her teenage years. And kidnapping in those days, it was not a big deal. Now you go to prison for it, correct? But for the next 5 years till I was 10 years old, it was an adventure living in the back of a car, living in tents, living in old flop houses. She would work 2 weeks in one town, 2 weeks in another, usually as a waitress, to try and keep away from my father, who was always looking for him, as I learned later on. And it took this 5-year journey to get to Arizona. We lived in Michigan for a while, in state parks until the snows came, and then she would get an old flop house somewhere. But again, just this strange, strange childhood. And ended up in Seligman, Arizona at the age of 10 years old. Now, nobody knows where Seligman, Arizona is. It's on Old Route 66. But anybody that saw the Disney animation movie Cars, you're shaking your head. Radiator Springs is Seligman, Arizona. In fact, I was so fortunate just before the Disney Imagers were getting ready to produce that movie, I happened to be in Seligman visiting some friends in a restaurant, and they introduced me to the Imagers and said, here's a boy that lived here during those days, so he can give you some tips of what it was like back in the early 50s. But when we hit Seligman, Arizona, my mother had run completely out of money, out of food, out of everything else, and a rancher took us in and provided us a place to live for the next 3 months. We slept on his kitchen floor. My mother was able to obtain work as a motel maid, and they got me a job starting at 10 years old, washing dishes at a little local restaurant. And that's the first time in those 5 years that we lived in a steady place, even though we're staying at somebody else's house or sleeping on a kitchen floor. But we were able to, between the two of our incomes, get an old travel trailer that they allowed us to park on a street behind an old motel. And it was rough during that time, but I had met a man named Juan Delgadillo who ran it's like a Dairy Queen, it's called Snowcap in Seligman, and it's such an iconic thing today, the Snowcap and Juan Delgadillo, that people from all over the world come just to visit that little Dairy Queen type place and meet Juan, who recently passed away, unfortunately. Juan became my father figure. And he always told me to be positive about everything, to just help whenever you can. There's people that are worse off than you, even though half the town was feeding us. And Juan, in fact, said, someday, Frank, when you can, give back. Now, this is the 50s. Give back was not a term. And I said, Juan, how can I give back? I can't even hardly afford to feed myself. And he said, Frank, do you see Mrs. Sanchez over there? Do you see the weeds in her yard? You can go pull those weeds, because Mrs. Sanchez is always bringing you beans and tortillas. He said, you see Mr. Ortega? He's trying to fix up that old boxcar so the family can move in there, and he could sure use help on that. You can help scrape paint and help him sand and so on. That's how you can give back, and I always remembered that. Now, unfortunately, starting in 7th grade, my mother decided that she could no longer afford me, and she told me, I'm moving, and you can find a place to stay in Seligman. And she took off for a couple years, and that should have been a very negative experience. But Juan, again, said, turn the negative to the positive. And I found a lady, in fact, it was Mrs. Sanchez, who said, you can pay room and board, $20 a week, and I was making $23 a week, washing dishes, and you can stay at my place. And I was devastated by all this, but Juan again said, hey, there's the positive. Look, all of a sudden you're gonna have your own room. You're gonna have a bathroom and a shower, because I had to go use the Santa Fe Railroad showers. And he said, this is all a positive thing. And it was a great 2 years. And after that particular time, my mother said, hey, why don't you come down to where I moved to Prescott, and we got back together. But we're just gonna go fast forward. Finished high school, went into the Air Force, served during the Vietnam era, but I was not a Vietnam combat veteran. They decided I needed to protect England for 4 years. But just a great experience in the Air Force. And use that work ethic that Juan had taught me and always keep that positive attitude. Following the Air Force, I went to work for Motorola for 7 years in Phoenix. And I could never really adjust to city life. I was a cowboy, and it just didn't really fit me, even though I had an excellent job as a engineering technician making a very good salary. But a lot of my friends from high school had joined the Arizona Highway Patrol, and over that 7 years, they kept saying, Frank, why don't you get on the patrol? You could use your experience, your technical knowledge with engineering, you'll make a good patrolman. So on a whim, I applied for the Arizona Highway Patrol in 1972, was accepted, and started this whole new career, which I completed recently with 42 years, and retired as a homicide detective with the Arizona State Police. Thank you. But after my initial training, they started a new motorcycle program with the Arizona Highway Patrol, and I was asked if I wanted to join that. And we did our initial training here in California, up at Sacramento with California Highway Patrol. And when we completed that, our uniforms, our motorcycles, our equipment were all identical except ours said Arizona, obviously, theirs said California. And I was assigned to a squad of 10 men that worked the state of Arizona. We'd be 2 weeks in one town, 2 weeks in another, and it was always a two-man team wherever we were scattered about. And during this period, the television show Chips became very popular. Okay, those that are shaking your heads, you're showing your age. What's so funny is Chips is back on the air, and it's quite popular again, all the old reruns. But what was so great for us with Chips is before, when we would go into these towns, especially the kids, mom would say, there's a policeman, if you do something bad, he's gonna rush you and take you to jail. And the kids would always kind of, when they see a policeman, especially wearing the black leather jackets and big boots and everything else. But now, because of the popularity of the show Chips, we'd ride into town, the two-man team, and all the kids, hey, Ponch, hey, John. In fact, I could have been Ponch John because I had very red hair at the time and very tan, so I could have been either one. But again, it was a great PR thing. So we got permission from our commanders when we had a little bit of off time to go to the local grade schools and start talking about bicycle safety with the children, which they could care less about, but what they loved was they could get on our motorcycles, blow the side and everything. And again, it was a great PR tool. And really started working with the children. And I started thinking then a little about Juan, and maybe somehow I'm giving back just a little bit. In 1978, I was involved in a high-speed chase with a drunk driver. And another drunk driver ran a stop sign, and I ran into him at 80 miles an hour broadside. And I was told later the crash was spectacular. It resulted in my death. It was called a 963A. My partner could not revive me. He called it in 963A, means officer killed in the line of duty. No heart, no heartbeat, no pulse. And he tried for several minutes, mouth to mouth, to bring me back, heart massage. An off-duty emergency room nurse from California drove up on the scene and said, please, let me try, let me try. And for an additional 4 minutes, she performed CPR, and in fact, brought me back to life. Now, and I applaud her, thank you. I learned about this whole experience later. You get involved in something like this, you have to talk to psychologists, make sure you're not goofy and go back to work. But I learned what I had experienced was during this death thing of going through the tunnel that some of you may be familiar with. As your life goes away, you see this tunnel, you see a light, the light closes, and you're dead, clinically dead. As they come back to life, and this happens a lot in emergency rooms, that tunnel starts opening, and again, that little bit of light, and you start seeing things and feeling senses. Your senses start coming back. And you always have to have humor in police work. And as my senses started coming back, the first thing I felt was a sense of touch. And there's something tickling my face. And my vision wasn't back yet, but I could feel it, something. And then the sense of smell, like a very nice, sweet, almost like a perfume or something. And then the sense of hearing with all the noise going around, and this very nice, come back, come back, come back. And then my eyes open up, and I've got this beautiful blonde with a lip lock on my lips. And that sense was, if I'm in heaven, I'm enjoying this. This is not going to be bad. But again, this young lady had brought me back to life. She earned a lot of roses over the years following that when I did stay in touch with her. But surviving that accident, and my partner also had tried to bring me back to life, and I'm so glad that I didn't wake up with a sense of him, because this guy had a big bushy mustache, usually full of bugs and everything, and typical motorcycle officer. But it took about 6 months to recover from that accident. Severe skull fracture, brain injury, etc., some broken bones. And every police officer I've ever worked with, we're spiritual. We believe in a higher being. You go to work every day, please allow me to come home. You get home, thank you for allowing me to come work and come home. And I started thinking, why did I survive this accident? What's my mission? What am I supposed to do? In 1980, April of 1980, and again, like I say, I'm on a squad that works all over Arizona. I'm about 100 miles out of Phoenix. One of those beautiful mornings, started at 5 in the morning, just a crisp up in the mountains. And I get a call from our dispatcher saying, please find the nearest payphone. Now remember, there's no cell phones in 1980. And call the dispatch center immediately. We have an important mission. And it took about 50 miles to find the nearest payphone, headed down towards the Phoenix area. Called, and they said, there's a 7-year-old boy named Chris who's in the hospital. His heroes are Punch and John from the television show Chips, and he always tells his mother, I'm going to be a motorcycle officer when I grow up. They further told me that Chris has about 2 weeks to live because he has terminal leukemia. And the director has asked, because of your work with children, if you can get to Phoenix, and when the helicopter, we're going to send a helicopter to his hospital to pick him up and fly him to our headquarters building, and I want you to be standing by when the helicopter lands so you can meet Chris. And I couldn't even imagine what this is all about. And the fun thing is they said, you're authorized to go code 2 to Phoenix, because I had about another 50 miles to go. Code 2 means I can break every traffic law there is. And I'm not going to get a complaint. No complaint letters or days off. But I arrived in Phoenix, and they timed it so when I arrived and got set up, they would bring the helicopter in. Helicopter landed, and I expected our paramedics to bring out this poor boy, this poor little sick little boy. Instead, the minute the doors open, pair of red sneakers, and this boy jumps up, runs to the motorcycle, a high five. Hi, I'm Chris. Can I get on your motorcycle? And I'm just thinking, this boy just came off IVs, but he's running around like a typical 7-year-old. And his mother, who had flown with him, I could see her, and she's got tears in her eyes. And I'm thinking, she's seeing her 7-year-old running around again instead of being hooked up to these IVs. And Chris is all over that motorcycle. He had watched Chips so much, he knew every button and switch on there. He said, this is the siren, can I do that? Yes, you can. This is the red lights, can I do that? Yes, you can. Let me open up your saddlebags and see if you have the stuff like Punch and John have in there. Okay, Chris. It was just a great day. And we were allowed to take the children at that time for rides on the motorcycle in the parking lot. And I said, okay, Chris, you ready to go for a ride? We got a helmet for him. No, I don't want to ride on a motorcycle. Well, Chris, you just rode in the helicopter. What's wrong? Helicopters have doors. We learned doors were very important to Chris. He did not want to ride on the motorcycle at that time. So one of the squad cars pulled up. I said, how would you like to help drive that squad car? Yeah, because squad cars have doors. He jumped on the sergeant's lap. They went in the parking lot, and he was chewing bubble gum. And he blew this big, giant bubble. He's helping steer this squad car. And his mother was standing next to me, and I said, look, there's our bubblegum trooper. And she wrote a book titled The Little Bubblegum Trooper, which is still available on Amazon today. But Chris went on that day to become the first and only honorary Highway Patrol officer in the history of the Arizona Highway Patrol. Now, this is 36 years ago. Complete with his own smoky hat, his own badge, his own certificate, toured the Army. He had the greatest day. And his doctor, who was with him, told his mother, I don't understand. His vitals are so good. Why don't you take him home, back to his comfort zone, instead of back to the hospital, which they did. And we were real happy what we had done for Chris. We started thinking, wait a minute, we have the first only highway patrolman again to this day, but they need a uniform. And uniforms were custom made in those days. So we went to the uniform shop just as they were closing. It was about 5 o'clock, and said, hey, we got this little boy. He's about this high, this wide. Can you make a uniform for him? 2 ladies spent all evening custom making this little uniform for Chris. The next day, again, with the permission of our commanders, they led a whole group of people out to Chris's neighborhood. Red lights and siren, you can imagine the neighbors, right? Chris comes running out. All his new buddies are there. We hand him his uniform. He's just ecstatic. Runs in, comes back out, just strutting with his new uniform. And he says, am I official Highway Patrol officer now? Yes, you are, Chris. He said, well, how do I be a motorcycle officer? That's what I really want to be. That's what my wish is. First time we heard that word, my wish. So I just started teasing him about the training we go through, and I said, it's a shame you don't have a motorcycle. We train you right here. We set up traffic cones in the driveway. Chris was a step ahead of me. He runs in the house and comes riding out on a little battery-operated motorcycle that his mother had got for him in place of a wheelchair. And I just started laughing because he had on the helmet we gave him. He had on aviator glasses. But the biggest thing was he had on rubber mucking boots, like wear on the ranch, where he had tucked his pants in so they looked like motorcycle boots. I mean, this little boy was ready. He went through the course we set up for him. Did I pass, Frank? Yes, you did. When do I get my motorcycle wings? Well, those were custom made also. And I said, Chris, we'll get those ordered for you. Chris was allowed to stay home again that night. I went to the jeweler, ordered the motorcycle wings. 2 days later, I picked them up. I get a call. Chris is in the hospital in a coma. He's probably not going to survive the day. I went to the hospital, and Chris's uniform is hanging right by his bed. Just as I pinned on the motorcycle wings, Chris came out of a coma. He looks at me, he smiles. Am I a motorcycle officer now? Yes, you are, Chris. I handed him his uniform. He's rubbing the wings. He just starts laughing and giggling, talking to his mom. A few hours later, he passed away. Our department felt that we had lost a fellow officer. They asked myself and another officer if I would go back. Chris is going to be buried in a little town, Kewanee, Illinois. And if I would go back and give him a full police funeral. As I said, we had lost a fellow officer. We went back to Kewanee, and on the way, again, you have to have a little bit of humor. We're driving from Chicago to this town of Kewanee in a rental car, and we get stopped by Illinois State Police. And this is the days of the 55-mile speed limit. We're not speeding, but we're in full dress motor gear and everything else. And the officer says, okay, I'm curious, is this a scene out of Smokey and the Bandit or something? Are you guys in hot pursuit? What's going on? We explained the situation. And he said, my partner here years ago quit and joined the Arizona Highway Patrol hoping to become a motorcycle officer. I wonder if he ever made it. And he mentioned his name, and I said, wow, I just finished training him, and he just started. It's that small world thing. That set up a relationship with Illinois State Police. He said, we're going to escort you for the next 50 miles so you're not stopped. You can get there without any problems. Lead the way. When we arrived at the funeral home, we were met by several Illinois State Police, city police, and county police because that trooper called ahead to his commander, told him what's going on, and they sent this whole procession to help bury this fallen officer. Chris was buried in uniform. His grave marker reads, Chris Gracious, Arizona trooper. And we started receiving all sorts of press during this whole trip, from leaving Arizona, arriving in Chicago, arriving in Kewanee. And it was just a great response. And I kept seeing that from the people that didn't even know this little boy, how they wanted somehow to help him, even as he had passed away. But flying home to Arizona, I just started thinking, here's this little boy who had a wish, and we made it happen. Why can't we do that for other children? And that's the idea when the Make-A-Wish Foundation was born, on an airplane up about 36,000 feet.